And greetings, friends. On the first of this month of March, a time period started, a time period called Lent, which started on Ash Wednesday, and now for 40 days and 40 nights, people in the so-called Christian religion, mostly Catholics and some Protestants, Anglicans and so on, they start a time of fasting, a time of cleansing their soul and preparing themselves for 40 days and 40 nights. Then a couple of Sundays go by, and then comes Easter. So they're preparing themselves for Easter. And many of the Catholics say that this time frame represents the time when Jesus Christ of Nazareth went into the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, and there, of course, was tempted by Satan the devil. So these 40 days and nights of Lent commemorate that time that Jesus fasted for 40 days and nights in the wilderness. The problem is that when Christ fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, it didn't take place in the late winter, early spring months. It took place after the Feast of Tabernacles, during the autumn months, and not during the time of late winter, early spring. So again, as I keep insisting, where do a lot of these traditions come from? Now, as I keep insisting, you and I were born in a ready-made world. We didn't come up with Lent and Ash Wednesday and Christmas and Easter. We didn't come up with these religions that we see today in our world. We were born into it. But it's very rare that Christians, especially Christians, it's very rare that they look into these things to find out some of these things for themselves, to read the Bible, to read history, and find out where a lot of these things come from. Where did Lent come from? And does it commemorate the 40 days and nights that Jesus Christ spent in the wilderness, tempted by Satan? Well, when you look into the Bible and the chronology of when Jesus Christ was baptized, you will find that Jesus Christ was baptized. Baptism took place during the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, and that's in the autumn. These 40 days and nights take place in the spring, preparing for Easter. And again, where did Easter come from? You can't find Easter in the Bible. Now, we go through a lot of these festivals on other broadcasts on our YouTube channel, if you want to check that out, as well, about the origins of Easter and Christmas. Easter's not in the Bible. I read of Passover and the days of unleavened bread, but I don't read anything about Easter. So where did Lent come from? Well, it says here that the word Lent comes from an Old English word, Lengthen, which means spring of the year. So this fast that takes place in the spring. Jesus' fast took place in the autumn, after the Feast of Tabernacles. So obviously, the origins of Lent, it originates somewhere else rather than the Bible. Now, where did this originate, this fast of Lent? Irenaeus, who was a bishop of Gaul, which is modern-day France today, he wrote about this day, and he said, "For the controversy is not only concerning the day, but also concerning the very manner of the fast." He goes on to say, "This variety, in its observance," says Irenaeus, "has not originated in our time, but long before in that of our ancestors." So it didn't originate with the Jewish Apostolic Church. It originated with their ancestors, of course, in Gaul. And of course, they were pagans. It originated with our ancestors, he says. And it says, it is likely that they did not hold to strict accuracy and thus formed a custom for their posterity according to private fancy. Not according to the Bible, not according to the New Testament church, but according to their own private customs. Now, another source says here that as long as the perfection of the primitive church, that's the New Testament church, founded by Jesus Christ and the apostles, remained, as long as the perfection of the primitive church reign unbroken, wrote Cassian, a Catholic prelate of the 5th century, there was no observance of Lent. So, as long as the New Testament apostles were there in place, guiding the church, there was no observance of Lent. It just wasn't in the Church of God. So where did it come from? Well, it goes on to say here in this source, but when men began to decline from the apostolical fervor of devotion, then the priests in general agreed to recall them from secular cares by of fasting. And that's Antiquities of the Christian Church, Book 21, Chapter 1. So it didn't originate with the apostles, but as the church declined and became apostate, then the priests instituted this fast called Lent. Now, what ecclesiastical organization that fell away from the truth, went apostate, amalgamated this festival, this time period of fasting into their religion? They incorporated it into their religion and then forced it on the rest of the Christian world. Well, of course, that church is the church in Rome. When we look at the Catholic Encyclopedia, it says this: in any case, it is certain from the festival letters of St. Athanasius that in 331 he enjoined upon his flock a period of 40 days of fasting, preliminary to the Holy Week. Obviously, that's Lent. And second that in 339, after having traveled to Rome and over the greater part of Europe, he wrote in the strongest terms to urge this observance. So when he traveled to Rome, obviously Rome already had this fast in place along with Easter, and you read in this Eusebius the whole controversy with Easter and the Passover. The church in Rome introduced Easter as well as introducing this observance of Lent. And then when he went to Rome and then went back to his flock and urged his flock to do the same thing. And of course, the whole controversy with Easter, the church in Rome wanted to enforce this observance of Easter and obviously the observance of Lent to the rest of the Christian churches, and of course succeeded. As we read here in Hyslop's The Two Babylons, it says here that to conciliate the pagans to nominal Christianity, Rome, pursuing its usual policy, took measures to get the Christian and pagan festivals amalgamated, and by a complicated but skillful adjustment of the calendar. And it was found no difficult matter in general to get paganism and Christianity, now so far sunk in idolatry in this, as in so many other things, to shake hands. So obviously the church in Rome amalgamated this fast, and with the adjustment of the calendar, amalgamated this fast and put it 40 days before Easter, starting at Ash Wednesday, 40 days before Easter, and then after the Lent came, of course, what they call the Holy Week, and then Easter. So it was amalgamated by the church in Rome, and then forced it on the rest of the Christian world. So they took this time period of 40 days and nights from the pagans and not from the fast of Jesus Christ when he went into the wilderness 40 days and 40 nights. Now, this fast of the pagans, what does it actually mean? What is the original meaning of what we call Lent? I'll read you this from Hyslop in his Two Babylons, and I urge you to get a copy of this book. Hopefully you can find one, but you can actually print it off the internet if you wish. It says the 40 days of abstinence of Lent was directly borrowed from the worshippers of the Babylonian goddess. Such as Lent of 40 days in the spring of the year is still observed by the Yazidis, or pagan devil worshippers of Kurdistan, who have inherited from their early masters, the Babylonians. And that's where it came, the Babylonian mystery religion. Now, as the original story goes, it is shown that, of course, it originated in the Babylonian pagan religion, and then it came into Christianity. Christianity adopted this period of Lent. And it says, according to tradition, that Semiramis, the wife of Nimrod, the king of Babylon, she claimed that she'd been supernaturally impregnated by the sun god and gave birth to Tammuz. One day, while hunting, Tammuz was killed by a wild boar. Semiramis mourned for 40 days, and at the end of which Tammuz was supposedly back from the dead. She proclaimed herself Queen of Heaven, founded a celibate priesthood to worship her son, and declared its chief priest infallible, and memorialized her mourning in an annual 40-day period of denial, which took place, of course, in the springtime. It was the world's first counterfeit of the biblical story of the Redeemer, and it grew into a mother-child cult that was duplicated in almost every pagan mythology. And you see it all over the pagan world. So this period of Lent was actually the time when the Queen of Heaven, Semiramis, mourned for 40 days. That happened in the springtime. Mourned for her son, Tammuz. And then when the Church of Rome adopted this pagan observance with the adjustment of the calendar, instead of the spring, it takes place in the late winter, early spring months, the way they've adjusted it. But it is the time of the weeping of Tammuz. And we find in the Bible, in Ezekiel, the 8th chapter, here we see God taking Ezekiel by the lock of his hair to the temple, and he showed him all these abominations that were taking place in Jerusalem. And in verse 13 of Ezekiel 8, he says this. He says, "Turn thee yet again, and I will show you greater abominations that they do." And then he brought me to the door of the gate of the Lord's house, which was towards the north, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. And God says that this is an abomination. And this weeping for Tammuz, of course, is, of course, what people call Lent today. Notice what the Gabrielin Konkai's commentary says on page 612. It says, "Women wept for Tammuz, the Babylonian Dumuzi, the god of spring, who dies and revives each year. It was a vile, obscene cult, for with the worship of Tammuz were connected immoral. With the worship of Tammuz were connected immoral, licentious ceremonies, sun worship, the crown of all these abominations." And as we see here in Ezekiel, the 8th chapter, it says here that the women were weeping for Tammuz, and then it leads up to here, "Son of man, turn thee yet again," verse 15, "and I will show you greater abominations than these. And he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and behold, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs towards the temple of the Lord, and their faces towards the east, and they worship the sun towards the east." This is the Easter sunrise service that takes place after the weeping of Tammuz, as I read to you, that 40 days led to the so-called resurrection of Tammuz. That, of course, pagan mythologies have, and they copied from this Babylonian mystery religion. So here we see these practices of Lent, of the Easter sunrise service that people do every single year at Easter time. Lent leads up to and is the preparation for Easter, and people have the Easter sunrise service. All these rituals were taking place in paganism, and the apostate Christian church took up all these idolatrous practices and incorporated it into the Christian religion. But there's nothing Christian at all about these practices. They put Christian names and labels on it. And the Catholic Church says, "Oh, this commemorates the fasting of Jesus Christ 40 days in the wilderness. But when you look at history, you will see that it's got nothing to do with the fast of Jesus Christ. It has to do with the weeping of Tammuz. Now, does God allow the Christian church to do these things of incorporating into its religion idolatry and these pagan rituals? Well, absolutely not. Deuteronomy 12, Deuteronomy 18, Jeremiah the 10th chapter, God continually says, learn not the way of the heathen. And he says, don't inquire after their gods, saying, how do these nations serve their gods? Then turn around and worship me in the same way. God calls it here in Ezekiel 8 an abomination. Yet the Christian church does it every single year. For the BICOG Media, this is Peter Salemi.